All right, everybody, welcome back to a special edition of the Ramp Careers podcast. Today, I am joined by Kim Scott. Kim is an executive coach in Silicon Valley. She is and was an advisor to tremendously successful companies like Twitter and Dropbox and Qualtrics. She's had a well-documented and illustrious career at both Google and Apple, and she's also the author of several books, including Radical Candor and Just Work. And her work has actually had a profound impact on my career. Kim, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Of course. So I've given your intro, but we ask at the beginning of our podcast episodes for our audience, who is Kim Scott really?
It's funny. So my business career was kind of a crazy plot to subsidize my writing habit, in fact. And so who I am really is a writer. And I loved my career. I love my business career. But sometimes the things that we have the biggest passion for don't really pay the bills. So and that's okay. You can still have a great career in two tracks. And now the careers have merged into one, which I'm very happy about.
I'd say you did a pretty good job of merging the two and allowing the passion become the true reality. So that's awesome. So I have to admit, I've heard tons of interviews from you. And they're all fantastic. However, I can't really find one that focuses on that early start of your career. So those formative years, potentially the first role out of college. Tell us about your first job. Did you know 100% that was the route you wanted to take coming out of school? And if so, or if not, why?
I didn't know anything 100% then, and I still don't know anything 100% now. So in college, I studied Russian literature, and I had a grand plan. I was gonna sort of solve the problem of the Cold War by reading American literature and Russian literature and understanding the cultural problem. And then, of course, my junior year, towards the end of my junior year, the wall fell, and the Cold War was sort of over. So problem solved, And I went to Russia. I moved to Russia after college to work for Moscow Physical Technical Institute to write a paper on military conversion, so swords into plowshares. These military factories that were, like tank factories that were starting to make small tractors for the newly privatized farms. And the job offer letter I got explained that my salary would be $6 a month, but which maybe seemed low, but I didn't need to worry because there was nothing to buy in Moscow anyway. So that was the beginning, and I took it. I was like, that sounds great. That's what I'm going to do.
Awesome. When people think tech companies, that doesn't sound, maybe it's a technical company in Moscow, but it doesn't sound too much like Google or Apple or any of these other tech companies. So when was that transition point where you took what you thought you were going to do and moved it into what you are doing now?
Yeah. So, it was a gradual transition. It was 1990 when I moved to, so it was still the Soviet Union, in fact, when I moved there. And I was really just trying to figure out how I had no idea what I was going to do with my life or my career, or, as I said, what I really wanted to do was read and write novels, but I couldn't figure out a way to make a living doing that. So that job ended after the coup, and so I was looking around for another job. I wound up working for a diamond company, a New York-based diamond company, and started up a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. So, which also was not at all what I expected to do, but it was unexpectedly fun. And I would say, if I have one bit of advice for people, don't make too much of a plan. Open yourself up for experiences that you don't expect. And that job was what really actually got me interested in management. I write about this in Radical Candor. I had to hire these diamond cutters, these workers, and I thought this was going to be easy because I thought I was kind of super duper liberal, and I thought capitalism was a bunch of nonsense, and all you had to do to hire people was to pay them, right? And it turned out that these guys didn't just want money. They wanted a picnic. So I went off on this picnic with them, and it became clear, we shared a bottle of vodka, and it became clear by the end of the bottle of vodka that what they really wanted was to know that I cared about them, that if things went sideways in Russia, there would be someone to help them and their families get out. And this all of a sudden, so they wanted really someone who gave a damn. It wasn't the thing that I had to offer that the state didn't have to offer. It was not money. It was actually a relationship, a human relationship. And now all of a sudden management seemed like more of an interesting thing to me. So I think that was really the moment as I was drunk with these diamond cutters in this at this picnic, that management became interesting to me.
Yeah, that's quite a story. That's awesome, and very unique. I don't think I've spoken with any. We interview tons of managers, tons of CEOs and COOs and VPs of sales, CROs, and no one has had a story quite as unique as that. So that's really cool. I think the message is super received too for our audience. Folks in their early career is, experiment, try new things. You never know what could open your eyes to what you actually want to do. And it's okay not to know right away, right after school, what you want to do. I certainly didn't as well.
I heard somebody told me something that was really comforting to me, which I'll share. He said to me, he was a therapist, and he said to me, you know what? Only about 10% of people have a real vocation, and they confuse the hell out of the rest of us. And I found that very comforting as I was struggling to figure out what I wanted to do with my life.
Yeah, that's right. And growing up, I looked at my friends that wanted to just be a doctor or be a lawyer, and I was like,
Yeah.
how do you know that right now? I never wanted to just be one thing.
Yeah.
So when do you feel like in your career you really started hitting your stride?
I feel like I hit my stride when I quit. So this was some other advice that someone gave me that has been very helpful. Don't forget to quit. So I was in a job that was making me miserable, and I quit. And I didn't have another job lined up. And that was when I decided to sit down and write Radical Candor. Now, I thought it was going to take me about 3 months to write it. So I thought I was just having, and it took me 4 years. So also that's another, but it felt like it was, as I was working on it, I was enjoying it, and it felt like productive work. And so I kept going. And I was lucky at that point in my career that I had done Google stock that I got when I took that job had done really well. So I could afford to quit and also my husband was still working at Google. So for a couple of different reasons, I could afford to quit and just do what I finally do, what I had always wanted to do. So I think a couple of lessons from that. One is don't forget to quit, but also, it's okay to try to work hard to make money, to save the money, to do what you really want to do. Like I always felt a little guilty about that, but I don't know why. That was a waste of time, that guilt.
That's good. Those are good insights, and really productive. You don't hear that often. You often hear quite the opposite, which is work hard. If you get a job out of school, just make sure that you're doing the best job you can and stick to that track until you either get promoted or you see another opportunity within that specific track. And I think often forgot is, it's okay to quit. It's if in your circumstance, obviously the right move too. Both personally, professionally, and financially. So our audience is early career folks. And you don't typically get the harsh feedback through high school and through college. And when I say harsh, I mean the honest feedback. You're often told through a grade or through through your parents, like what you're doing right or wrong. You don't ever really get feedback from a manager or a boss. So what advice do you have for folks entering that first job on how to receive advice from their first managers?
Yeah, I think it's so important to learn how to solicit feedback. And And sometimes the feedback is going to sting a little bit, so you got to get ready for that. But one of the biggest risks, especially early in your career, is that you don't get any feedback. And everybody sort of says this kind of banal, oh yeah, everything's fine, you're doing fine, but you don't feel like everything's fine. You feel there were times in my career where I felt like a dead man walking, and that's a bad feeling. So pay attention if you feel like something's not quite right, but nobody's telling you what it is. Learn how to ask. So there's 4 things I recommend in how to solicit feedback. One is, think about how you're going to ask. What question are you going to use? Because if you say, do you have any feedback for me? I can already tell you what the answer is. Oh no, everything's fine. Like, you may think it's hard for you to give your boss feedback, but it's also hard for your boss to give you feedback. This is one of the things my mom always used to tell me of like a snake, it's more scared of you than you are of it. Like, the same thing is, not that I'm comparing your boss to a snake, a poisonous snake, but your boss is as afraid of you often as you are of your boss. So just try to remember that and approach them and ask them in a way that really elicits feedback. So part of one of the questions that one of my coaches, Fred Kaufman, who wrote a wonderful book, Conscious Business, which I recommend to you, is, he said, ask the question, what can I do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? And that for me was very helpful. But other people have said, I could never imagine those words coming out of my mouth. And that's important. If you sound like Kim Scott, people won't believe that you really want the answer. So you've got to ask the question in a way that works for you. And then once you ask the question, you've got to embrace the discomfort. So that means you need to close your mouth, count to 6, and give the other person a chance to answer. And 6 seconds is a long time. Like, I'm going to be quiet now for 6 seconds. I'm going to be actually 3 seconds. That was 3 seconds, right? So you gotta count in your head: 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. So that's really important. And then almost no one can endure 6 seconds of silence. So they'll probably say something. So now you've dragged this poor soul out on a conversational limb they never wanted to go on. What do you do next? They're going to say something, and even though you've just solicited feedback, it's probably going to sting a little bit. And so it is your job to it is your job to sort of make sure that you're listening with the intent to understand, not to respond. Because it's tempting to get defensive and to start arguing, or criticize the criticism, start saying, well, you should have said it in a different way. You've got to make sure that you're listening. That you're really listening and that you're trying to understand what they're saying. So even if you're not sure what they mean, don't say, can you give me an example? Offer up an example yourself. Do you mean when I did blah, blah? If somebody says, Kim, you're moving too fast, which is feedback I got from my boss once. And I didn't really know what she meant. And so I said, you mean like when I did this? And she's like, no, that wasn't, and so that was like, it wasn't demanding of my boss that she tell me more, but I offered the example. You can also ask your friends. I asked a bunch of people about what does this mean? I'm moving. And they gave me some very harsh but useful examples, like, Kim, you're really fast to hit the bozo bit, or Kim, you're too fast to hit send. And that, I knew exactly what those things meant. So sort of make sure you're trying to understand the feedback. And last but not least, you've got to reward the candor when you get it. If somebody gives you some feedback, you've got to act on it. Now, you may disagree with the feedback, but let's first, if you agree with the feedback, fix the problem, and then go ask the person, did I go far enough? Did I overshoot? Another good advice that I got from one of my bosses about responding well to feedback is, what you should do, if somebody says you're too far to the left, you can't shoot to the center. You've got to shoot to the right. So you've got to actually overcorrect when you get. So for example, in the "you move too fast" feedback, my boss said, you will know that you have fixed this problem when somebody tells you you're moving too slow, not when they say you're doing it just right. And so that was really helpful. So you've got to reward the candor. Now, sometimes you're going to disagree with the feedback, and that's okay. You don't have to pretend. If you say, oh, thank you for the feedback, that's not a reward. That's actually a brush off, which it just shows you disagree and you're not willing to talk about it. So if you really disagree with the feedback, then what you need to do is first look for that 5 or 10% of what was said that you can agree with to demonstrate that you're not defensive or shut down the feedback. And then have a respectful conversation about why you disagree. And we often fear, especially with our managers, but with any relationship in our life, that a disagreement will hurt the relationship. But actually, what hurts the relationship is ignoring what the other person told us. A respectful disagreement actually can build. Some of the best professional relationships of my career started with a disagreement, but a disagreement done well. And especially if the feedback is coming from your boss, at a certain point you have to listen, challenge, commit. You have to disagree and commit. So you don't want to argue endlessly, but just if you've said your piece, then you don't feel a loss of agency, even in the face of feedback that you disagree with, but that you have to act on anyway.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for that. And I was, thinking while you were saying that about some of the tough conversations that I've had with bosses and how I acted. And typically in my early career, I would probably respond with a brush off, right? Thank you for your feedback. Go back to doing my job. And and more recently, I've certainly been a manager more recently, and when folks give me feedback, I think I take it much more seriously because I solicit it and I rarely receive it. So I'm now in that position where I crave it and I really want it and I do take it seriously. So I think that's the mentality on it. It's totally switched. And it brings me to one of my next questions for you is, do you think it's okay as an entry level or early career employee to give your boss feedback?
100%. The people I know who have been most successful are people like hierarchy is really, it's inevitable, but it's a dangerous thing because you do well in your career when you build good relationships. And there are a few things that are more damaging to a relationship than a power imbalance. And so if you don't have the power in the relationship, you need to kind of pretend that you do. You need to pick some up. And if you do have it, you need to put it down so that you can get on a level playing field and have a real conversation. So I think that it is really a good idea to give feedback to your boss. But remember, there's an order of operations. You want to start by soliciting feedback. You want to make sure that you are asking for your boss's perspective first before you start. Don't dish it out before you prove you can take it. And there's another important point here, which is that remember, when you're early in your career, you are probably going deep on something. So you have a depth of knowledge that your boss may not have. But your boss also has a breadth of knowledge that you may not have. So they're responsible for sort of a wider scope of things than you are. And sometimes your boss will make a decision that from your perspective seems irrational or ridiculous. But if you can begin to understand what your boss's scope of responsibility is, it makes a little bit more sense. So make sure that you're not being that you're open to the fact that you don't know everything when you're giving some feedback. That your boss might not know some things that you know, but your boss also might know some things that you don't know. So your boss should be humble, but you also should be humble. I think really arrogant or self-righteous. In my new book, Just Work, I talk about self-righteous shaming. And that is the tool of the powerless. And the problem with that tool, I don't want to take a tool away from the powerless, except this tool, self-righteous shaming, it's counterproductive. So it's not a good tool to use. So make sure that that you are not doing that when you're offering feedback to your boss. The other thing to think about is, none of us want to kiss ass, but offering praise is not necessarily kissing ass. It's telling your boss, it's giving voice to what you appreciate. It's sort of a gratitude. So if you think about it in terms of gratitude, then you can realize that if you share the good things, the things that you appreciate about your boss with your boss, then they'll do more of them, and they'll do it more often. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, this is really good. I love the power imbalance stuff. It's often very intimidating for somebody to give their boss feedback, but I do think that also helps to level set, where you're at in your relationship too.
There's
So,
there's one more thing on that before we move on that just
yeah,
popped into my head. I started this company, Just Work, with Trier Bryant, who's an officer in the Air Force, and she made a really good point. She said, in the military, we teach leadership, but we also teach followership. And I think in business, we only teach leadership. And that's a real problem. Like being a good follower, there is an art to it and there is dignity to it. I think we have this notion that we must always be the leader. And that just sort of by definition can't be correct. So I think learning how to be a good follower with agency and dignity is really important.
yeah, and in some ways, being a good follower is also being a good leader, right? It's
Yes.
proactively, and you're following instructions and directions, but when you see something wrong, you correct, and it may not be because you're being arrogant or an a-hole. It could just be you've noticed something and you don't want the
Yeah.
person in charge to look foolish, right?
Yeah, exactly.
A big part of our program at Ramped is teaching early career folks how to find mentors. I know I had some mentors early in my career that really helped me improve, not just on the hard skills, like the stuff that I'm doing day to day, but the soft skills and how to develop relationships. Who are some of your early mentors, and how did you cultivate relationships with them?
So I think that a few things on the topic of mentors. One is that I've had mentors who worked for me, right? So so a mentor is not always someone who's ahead of you in your career. You can learn from everyone, and I think it's really important to remember that. I think when you are approaching someone for some help, and by the way, asking for help is like asking for an investment. It's an act of power. It's not an act of powerlessness. So don't feel like you're going hat in hand when you're asking for help. You're actually it is a really strong thing to do. So when you're asking for help of someone who is more senior than you are in the organization, you want to be really conscious of their time. One of the things that doesn't work is saying, can we go get a cup of coffee? Like what people want to do, especially when they're your boss's boss or someone that they want to give you advice, they want to help, but they want to help quickly. And so being aware of how you can ask for help in a way that is efficient for the other person is really, really important. So be respectful of people's time, I think, is one of the most important bits of advice. I was speaking with Andy Grove, who was the CEO of Intel at one point. And there was a journalist who was writing about mentorship. And someone said, oh, Andy Grove was a great mentor to me. He gave me this advice and it changed the trajectory of my life. And Andy said, it was hard for me to talk with this journalist because the fact of the matter is what happened in that case is we had flown somewhere on a business trip together. We took a cab to the meeting, and in the cab ride, he asked me a question, and I listened and I answered the question, but that was it. That was like the extent. and like, that's okay. That's a lot, it changed the trajectory of this guy's career, yeah. But he didn't sort of keep following up and saying, can we have lunch? So you can get a lot out of people in just a couple of minutes. The other thing I will say is some really good advice I got from people in the course of my career came from, even though there was one guy in my career who gave me really good advice before I went to business school. And he said, look, when you go into these classes, it's like going into a meeting and you're not fully prepared, and because other people are going to know a lot more than you. And what you do in that situation is you listen for the first half intently, and then you summarize what's been said and pivot the conversation in a new and interesting direction. And that was really good advice. And I'm really glad that I took it from him, because there was a decent chance I wasn't even going to talk to him. I was really mad at him. He had been kind of a sexist pig to me. I will say he had been really awful. But even when people are not like someone you really like and admire, if you can still be open to hearing what they have to say and listening to them, that also is all for the good.
Good. Well, can learn from anyone.
Yes.
Hopefully for our audience, they aren't treating you like like a sexist pig.
I promise you, a lot of people here are getting really badly missed. By the way, here's another really good piece of advice. If you, there's someone I follow on Twitter who's a Black engineering leader at Google. Mecca is his name, MEKKA. And he had a thread on the difficulty anchor. And the idea is that, I write about this in Just Work, the idea is that if you are underrepresented, and one of the things that's very likely to happen to you is that if you do something that's very difficult, people will say, oh, that's easy. They dismiss, if Kim did it, it must be easy. And so he recommends reaching out to someone, not someone who necessarily looks like you, but someone who is known for being kind of a hard ass in the organization, and describing the problem to them before you try to fix it, and asking them if you can come to them when you get stuck on something, as you're working on this project. And then when people try to say later, oh, that was no big deal, this difficulty anchor will say, yes, it was a big deal. This was a hard problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's I haven't tried that before. I think that makes a ton of sense, and I think it probably opens the discussion in a more transparent and level playing field as well.
Yeah.
As an early career employee, kind of off what we were saying, sometimes you find yourself in a situation with a very poor manager, and somebody who at an early stage in your career is going to have a very negative impact. Often you're probably given guidance from your parents or those close to you that you should just stick with it. You should ride it out. You've only been there for a couple months. Real or perceived, you're kind of in between a rock and a hard place. What do you do in that situation? What do you do when you have a poor manager and you're early in your career? So you're just in this kind of I'm stuck situation.
I think that we are rarely as stuck as we think we are. So my advice to you in that situation is to locate the exit nearest you. And the reason for this, you may not wind up leaving, but if you know you have an off ramp, then you can afford to take the risk of going to this manager and explaining to them the position that they're putting you in. And maybe the person will fix the problem. Maybe not, but you've got an off ramp. So it becomes safer to give the person this feedback. I think that we are not nearly focused enough on the damage that a bad boss does. I mean, I have seen people develop insomnia. I've seen people sort of break out in rashes. Like, a bad boss really has a huge impact on your life. At one point, I had a boss who was really, he belittled me. And I went to have my annual checkup, and I had shrunk half an inch. Like, it had physically manifested. And I'm very short. I'm only 5'1". I didn't have half an inch to give. And my doctor said, do you really need this job? This is doing
That's
physical
bad.
damage. Yeah. And so I think you want to have some compassion for yourself and for the fact that having a bad boss is really a terrible thing, and you don't have to put up with it. I mean, I switched jobs pretty often, and I seem to have done okay in the course of my career. So, I think it's also important to factor in the impact that bad boss is having on you and your sort of your mental health and your physical health.
Yeah, I have to admit I've been stuck in that situation too and seen a doctor, and I was having minor anxiety attacks, and he at the time I didn't know what it was about, and it was about the bad boss, and I ended up quitting, and it was one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. But I was he prescribed me beta blockers, and at that point I was like, you know what, this is not
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, I can take beta blockers, or I could just
I could
quit.
just
Like, why don't we just quit?
let's just quit. This is way different.
Yeah.
So if you could go back in time, and now that you have the benefit of hindsight, and give yourself one piece of advice, what would you say to younger Kim Scott?
I think that I got a lot of advice early in my career about how to sort of navigate around workplace injustice, around bias, prejudice, bullying that I encountered. And I wish that I had tried to change it rather than just navigate around it earlier. I could have. I was, in many ways, I was in a privileged position, and I could have done more to fight the power without blowing up my career. So that's and it's one of the things I admire a lot about this generation, is that this generation entering the workplace now is much less likely to put up with the kind of crap that I put up with.
I think it's the natural reaction. We probably skewed way too far to the right, so our generation is way left. Kind of a callback to what you were saying in the beginning. We just attack it.
I think it's awesome. I love it. I admire it.
It's great. It's great. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about your new book, Just Work. So tell us about the book. Obviously, it's out there. There's been a ton of great press on it, and what folks, especially early career folks, can learn from it.
So, in some ways, Just Work is my effort to go back and fix that problem, that I take that advice, offer that advice for my younger self. So what I tried to do in the book is to break down bias, prejudice, and bullying. I think very often we conflate those three problems as though they're one and the same thing, and they're actually very different. And the way that we can respond to each one is different. So, simple definition: bias is not meaning it, prejudice is meaning it. It's a conscious belief, unlike bias. And bullying is being mean. There's no belief at all, but they're just, this person's just being an asshole. Yeah. And so, how do you respond to each? So, with bias, you want to have an I statement, which sort of invites the other person in to understand things the way that you understand it. So I don't think you're going to take me seriously when you're calling me honey, for example. And but whereas with prejudice, you want an it statement, which sort of demarcates the boundary between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want and another person's freedom not to have that belief imposed upon them. So it is an HR violation for you to tell me I'm neglecting my children by showing up at work today, which someone did to me once. So an it statement can appeal to a company policy. It can appeal to the law. It is illegal not to give people the best clients because they are the mother of young children, or it is ridiculous not to assign the right people to the right accounts because that one person is a parent and another isn't. So that's an it statement. Now, a you statement is very different from these. A you statement sort of pushes the person away. So in the case of bias, you want to invite them in. In the case of bullying, you want to push them away. So you can't talk to me like that. Or what's going on for you here? And I learned this from my daughter, actually, when she was in third grade. She was getting bullied on the playground. And I was kind of encouraging her to use an I statement. And, I feel sad and she banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, he is trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell him he succeeded? And I thought, gosh, that's a really good point. Yeah. Yeah. And so that's why you want the you statement. A you statement sort of puts you in the active role. You're not answering the other person's questions. You're making them answer your questions or respond to you with a you statement. So that's one of the things that I try to do is, and I also try to think about it shouldn't be all on the people who are harmed to deal with bias, prejudice, and bullying. So what can you do as an upstander when you notice one person expressing bias towards another? How can you step up and intervene in those situations? And then the next part of the book talks about what happens when power enters the equation, and then you get discrimination, harassment, and physical violation. So I talk about how you, as someone early in your career, can fight the power without blowing up your career.
It's really smart. And I think what's important and why everybody should read this book right now as an early career person is because you're not taught this in school. Like you go through, your academic career, elementary school, junior high, high school, college, and you're never taught, situationally, what do I do if I have X person treating me Y way in the workplace? And that, is just lost. It's just completely lost. And I think it's something that, at Ramped, we barely scratch the surface on it. We try to, but I think this is something that for our audience, absolutely, you should read this book and understand, about these situations, come into your career knowing how to deal with them rather than either one, just, taking it, which sounds like many of us have done, or two, responding in a way that is, out of anger, out of, pure emotion, and you look a certain way in the professional environment. So, it's great. And I think this is required reading. So one last question for you, and I think it's kind of off the book and off of the lack of education that folks get, coming up through their academic career is, what do you do when you don't know what to say in a work environment?
Yeah, I think my great grandmother needle pointed a pillow for her daughters, and the pillow said, "Say something. You can always take it back." And so I think we too often we default to silence, and so you don't have to say the exact right thing, and you don't have to know whether it's bias, prejudice, or bullying that you're confronting. Just say something. If your instinct tells you it's prejudice, then start with the word "it." And even if you don't know what's going to come out of your mouth next, just say "it," and then something will come. Sometimes it's just about momentum. Or if you think it's bias, start with the word "I," even if you don't know what's going to come out of your mouth next, and then notice. Or if it's bullying, say "you." And if it seems like it might escalate, you can just ask an innocuous question. "You, where'd you get that shirt?" But now the other person is answering your questions, and you may learn when you respond that what you thought was bias is actually prejudice, or what you thought was prejudice is actually bullying, or what you thought was bullying was actually bias. And that's okay. You don't have to get it right all the time. I think that's really the moral of the story is let's give ourselves a little bit of grace to just try to say something and to realize that when you say something, it's not only to protect yourself or to be an upstander, it's also to protect that person who's making a mistake. Because very often when someone is bullying someone else, they don't even realize what they're doing. And if they don't get any feedback, then they're going to keep doing it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Very tactical advice that you can take with you for the rest of your career. Well, Kim, this has been an absolute pleasure. There's so many things that our audience can learn from you and from your books and your works. And I totally recommend folks check out both Radical Candor and Just Work. They've had a profound impact on my career, and I'm lucky enough to have read Radical Candor early in my career when I was starting to be a manager. But thank you so much for joining on the podcast. We really, really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much, and good luck in your careers. Try to have fun. That's the most important advice.
Awesome. I love that. Thank you.